good captain, maybe a little bit of a bully. I liked everybody else to be doing their work, you know, and it went well that way.
Well, Ronnie Yeats was one of the cornerstones here at Liverpool. His coming, along with Ian St John around the same time, was the very beginning of Liverpool's rise.
How good was Ron Yates? That question haunts football history because the answer matters more than you think. Imagine being a giant, a mountain of a man, someone who dominated every pitch you walked on, and then imagine that memory slipping away. That is what happened to Ron Yates in his later years. Heavy leather footballs and repetitive heading in the 1960s left invisible marks on his brain. Alzheimer's disease crept in. The mind that organized defenses began to fade. Even legends pay a cost. But as his memory dimmed, his legacy blazed brighter than ever. When you talk to the legends who faced him, played beside him, and watched him transform Liverpool, you understand something profound. Ron Yates was the foundation upon which an entire era was built. Today, we hear what Shankly called him a colossus. We discover why Sir Bobby Charlton felt suffocated by his presence. This is how one man became the mountain that made everyone around him braver. If this video is helping you understand football history, give it some hype. Just hit that button right now. Let us start with Tommy Smith, because his story ties everything together at the end of Yates's Liverpool journey. Smith came to Anfield as a young defender, and he saw Ron Yates and saw a father figure, a mentor. Smith became the Iron Man of Anfield, but he learned everything from Yates. The partnership between them was one of the fiercest defensive units in English football history. They provided the backbone for 2 league titles and the club's first FA Cup. Smith spoke about Yates constantly, about the mental toughness he showed, about fixing mistakes before they became problems. The Anfield way meant everyone was a captain. All 11 players took responsibility. Standards were non-negotiable. Yates, as the second longest-serving captain in Liverpool's history at retirement, embodied that completely, led by setting standards, making sure younger players understood that mediocrity was not allowed. Under his guidance, players were integrated into a family atmosphere, but it was a family with strict rules. Yates influenced Smith so deeply that it shaped the entire style of play he became famous for. That effective, no-nonsense defensive approach that dominated the First Division came directly from watching Yates work. Smith learned that football at the highest level was about getting the job done and executing with precision. Now let us move to Billy McNeill. McNeill played for Celtic, and he was doing something similar to what Yates was doing at Liverpool. Both were powerful, athletic centre-halves who pioneered a new kind of defender. Before them, centre-halves mostly just blocked things, but McNeill and Yates were different. They were organisers. They were leaders. They could think tactically. Yates had captained every team he ever played for. Shankly saw that and knew it was what he needed. The centre-half role in the 1960s was changing, moving from stationary stopper to dynamic organiser. Yates was at the front of that evolution. Yes, he was a brutish stopper when needed, but his real strength was his assured presence. That presence gave security to teammates. This archetype was crucial for European competition. Leaders like Yates helped bring professionalism and discipline to European matches. McNeill represented the same thing at Celtic, and together, these Scottish powerhouses showed that the centre-half could be more than muscle. He could be a brain. He could be a leader who elevated everyone around him simply by doing his job at the highest level. Roger Hunt was one of the great goal scorers of Liverpool's golden era, and he gave us a different angle on Yates. Hunt saw Yates as the bedrock. That was his word, bedrock. He said Yates was a firm platform, something you could build on, something that would not crack under pressure. Hunt was focused on his own craft, on practicing shooting on the turn, on the technical details that made him lethal in the penalty box, but he knew none of it meant anything without Yates behind him. The defence had to be rock solid. Goalkeeper had to be assured. The centre-half had to be immovable. That was what Yates was. Hunt respected that because he understood that great attacking play happens in the shadow of great defending. During Yates's early years at Liverpool, he had military obligations. He was stationed in the army at Aldershot, and he suffered from severe travel sickness. Think about that for a moment. Think about suffering from travel sickness so bad that you can barely get through a journey, and then choosing to travel over 1,000 miles every single week to play football. That is commitment. That is the kind of standard Yates set. He would take the train and the coach for hours, feeling ill the entire way, because he believed in the commitment he had made to his teammates. Hunt watched that. He saw Yates doing that week after week, never complaining, never asking for special treatment, just showing up and being brilliant. That became the culture at Liverpool. That became what it meant to play for the club. For Hunt, it was why Yeats was so crucial, not just because he was tall and strong, but because he was a symbol of the standards Liverpool was building. He was proof that you gave everything. He was proof that you did not chase the game recklessly, but rather maintained the discipline required to exploit chances when they came. Hunt scored so many goals because behind him there was a player like Yeats, who made sure the opposition never had time to settle, never had space to plan attacks. Now let us talk about Ian St John, and this is where the human side of Yeats really comes through. St John and Yeats arrived at Liverpool around the same time, became best mates, proper best mates. Their arrival marked the very beginning of Liverpool's rise from being a nothing club to being a powerhouse. John was a striker, and he needed to believe in what was happening around him. He needed to feel secure. When he first met Yeats, he thought Yeats was the coach. That is how much of an authority figure Yeats was. Just his presence, his stature, his aura of leadership made you think that this man had to be the one in charge. But it was more than just physical intimidation. St John described Yeats as a brilliant tackler, someone feared by opponents. But what really mattered was what Yeats was like inside the team. Inside Liverpool, Yeats was an encourager. He was not a critic. He was not someone who made teammates feel small. He lifted people up. He gave them confidence. That mental belief and security is exactly what St John and the attacking players needed. When you know that a mountain of a man is behind you, when you know that he will not let anything get past him, when you know he has your back, you can take risks, you can be creative, you can score goals for fun. That is exactly what Liverpool did during this period. They scored goals for fun because the attacking players had the freedom that only comes from absolute faith in the defence. The logic was simple but devastating. If Yeats neutralises the counter-attack, then our attacking players can push higher up the pitch. They can take chances. They can commit extra numbers forward because they trust that Yeats will stop anything coming back at them. St John remained Yeats's best mate for life. Even when Yeats was struggling with Alzheimer's in his later years, St John was there. That bond, forged during the Shankly Revolution, never broke. That tells you something about the quality of the man. The teammates who knew him best, who played alongside him, who saw him every single day. They loved him, not respected him, loved him. That is rare in football. That is very rare. That truly speaks to character. Finally, let us get to the heart of it all. Let us talk about Shankly and the era that defined everything. Bill Shankly arrived at Liverpool in 1959, and he looked around the club and he was disgusted by what he found. The club was happy-go-lucky, it was slap-happy, content to exist in mediocrity. The directors were fine with being just a few places from the bottom of the First Division. Shankly found that appalling. He believed that football clubs had to have standards, had to have ambition, had to have a clear vision for what they wanted to become. To make that happen, he needed a specific type of player. He did not just want technical skill, he wanted heart, he wanted commitment. He wanted players whose internal fire matched his own vision. In 1961, Shankly identified a player at Dundee United named Ron Yates, and he knew immediately that this was his man. This was the structural anchor he needed for everything else to work. When Yates arrived at Anfield, Shankly did something brilliant. He called a press conference and he invited all the journalists to come and take a walk around his centre half. He told them that Yates was a colossus, a mountain. He was doing two things at once. He was making a genuine assessment of Yeats's physical and mental qualities, but he was also creating a brand, a psychological image of impregnability that opponents would have to confront every single week. It was calculated and it worked perfectly. By comparing Yeats to a mountain, Shankly established a landscape where the opposition felt small. They felt powerless. The image of Liverpool's defence became about a man who could not be moved, who could not be passed, who was simply too big and too dominant to overcome. Yeats became the spine of the team. It was not just physical, it was psychological. It was about the message that Liverpool sent to opponents. When you look at Liverpool, you see a mountain. When you face Liverpool, you face something immovable. Yeats was the embodiment of that message. Shankly did have one initial concern about Yeats though. When the manager first worked with him, he thought Yeats might be too gentle. Yeats had good manners. He was not the type to throw elbows or go looking for trouble. So Shankly coached him. Shankly taught him aggression. He taught him how to use his body. He taught him how to dominate physically in ways that were legal, but absolutely effective. Yeats learned. He absorbed the lessons. He became not just physically dominant, but aggressively present in a way that changed how centre-halves could operate. Other managers started asking their centre-halves why they could not be more like Yeats. Shankly often joked that he could have a comedian in goal and still win matches because Yeats was so dominant at the back. That was not really a joke. That was Shankly's way of saying that Yeats was so effective at the base of the defence that almost anything could happen in front of him, the team would still get the result. The transformation of Liverpool was remarkable. Pre-Yeats, the club was in the second division, stagnant, going nowhere. Post-Yeats, the club got promoted. The club won the first division title. The club won the FA Cup. The club built a culture around leadership and standards and commitment. Shankly called it the 11 captains model. Every player was a captain in his own area. Every player had to take responsibility. Every player had to maintain standards. But it all started with Yeats. It all flowed from the centre-half position outward. Yeats's physical presence was crucial. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, but it was not just the height, it was the way he used his body. He had an incredible sense of timing in the air. He understood leverage. He knew how to position himself so that he could shield the ball from opponents and win headers with authority. He did not just jump, he owned the air. Opponents knew that when the ball went high, Yeats was going to win it. That certainty changed how Liverpool could play. Because Yeats won the initial ball, team could transition into the pass and move system. They could play football the way Shankly envisioned it. Quick, aggressive, committed, and utterly dominating. The 1960s in English football was an era of aerial duels. The long ball was a primary weapon. It was physical and it was demanding. Sir Bobby Charlton, perhaps the greatest creative force of that era, acknowledged that Yeats was suffocating to play against. Charlton struggled to create space in the final third because Yeats occupied so much of the pitch. He made the pitch feel smaller, suffocated opposition attacks before they could develop. That is an incredible compliment when you think about it. And Bobby Charlton is saying that you made football difficult for him. You were doing something extraordinary. Yeats's background made him perfect for what Shankly needed. He was born in 1937 in Aberdeen, and he grew up in a neighbourhood full of bomb craters from the Second World War. That was not an easy place. That was not soft. People who grew up in that environment learned about toughness early. Before he became a footballer, Yeats worked as a butcher's apprentice in a slaughterhouse. He started at 3 in the morning. He worked with his hands. Trained as a mason, he understood physical labor. He understood how to build things from raw materials. That was his background. That was his foundation. Shankly recognized that immediately. Shankly was obsessed with heart and commitment. And Yeats had both in abundance because his life had demanded it. His background made him credible to the supporters. He was not some kid who had been coddled. He was a working-class man who had made something of himself through sheer will and effort. When he stood in the center of the defense, he represented the community's own struggle for recognition and success. Supporters on the Kop saw themselves in him. They saw their own toughness reflected in his play. There is a famous story from the FA Cup presentation in 1965. Yeats was being presented to the Queen, and in that formal moment, with all the pomp and circumstance, he told her he was absolutely knackered, exhausted. That is who he was. No pretense. No false modesty. Just honest, authentic, grounded. That is the kind of player and person Yeats was. That is why he matters so much in Liverpool's history. How football evolves. By 1973, the game was changing. The defeat to Red Star Belgrade in European competition was a wake-up call. Continental sides were playing patient, technical football. They were building up from the back. They were using the ball rather than just lumping it forward. Shankly and the boot room coaches realized that the brutish stopper style, which Yeats had perfected, was not going to be enough anymore, so the club gradually moved toward more versatile defenders. Phil Thompson and Emlyn Hughes came through, players who could bring the ball out of the back and start attacks. Here is the crucial thing. That evolution was only possible because Yeats had created the foundation. Without the domestic titles, without the FA Cup victory, without the institutional confidence that Yeats had built, Liverpool would never have had the resources or the belief to transform their defensive approach. Yeats took a slap-happy club in the 1950s and built it into something that could dominate, first domestically and then globally. That platform allowed everything that came after, the continental evolution, the European dominance of the late 1970s. It all happened because Yeats had made sure that Liverpool was strong at the base. When you think about how good Ron Yates was, you have to consider all of this. You have to understand that he was not just tall, he was not just strong, he was a leader, he was a standard setter. He was a symbol of what Liverpool Football Club was becoming. Bill Shankly saw that in 1961 when he looked across at Dundee United and identified this man as the one who could anchor his vision. Sir Bobby Charlton felt it when he stepped onto the pitch and felt suffocated by Yeats's dominance. Ian St. John experienced it as the security that allowed him to be brave. Roger Hunt built his goal-scoring legacy on the back of it. Tommy Smith learned the lessons and became the next generation of leaders. Billy McNeil recognized him as a pioneer of a new era. All of those men, they all understood that Yeats was foundational. He was the mountain. He was the colossus. He was the architectural necessity of the Shankly Revolution. His presence ensured that when the world looked at Liverpool, they did not just see a football team, they saw a club that was built on rock, a club that was solid, a club that was going somewhere. The memory may have faded in his later years, but the legacy remains crystal clear. Ron Yates was the player who took a nothing club and made it into a bastion of success. He was the defender who inspired attackers. He was the captain who led by example and by standards. He was the working-class hero who embodied the values of the community he represented. That is how good Ron Yates was. That is why the legends remembered him the way they did. That is why his story still matters so much today.